Good afternoon, everybody, and thank you all for coming. We have an interesting topic today. One from that is certainly an ever-present element of life on Wall Street, and I think I've been arguing about compensation and incentives on Wall Street for the 35 years or so that I was involved in that world, and it actually entered into Main Street very much as a part of the financial crisis. Many people say the ultimate moral hazard is how people are paid on Wall Street. You'll hear that argument made that some times the profits are privatized and the losses are socialized, and so that very much was part of actually the debate that ended on Tuesday with people going to the polls. A lot of frustration about how TARP was provided in safety net to bankers, both at a macro sense, the institutions, but also for individuals, and bonuses are paid out. And there are always serious questions about how much of revenues and profits are actually paid to those on Wall Street, and are the incentives right or wrong. And so today we'll talk a little bit with the rear view mirror of looking at the crisis itself, but maybe we'll also have a forward perspective. Yeah, a great panel. Since I get to manage about 3,000 people, I'm very interested in this incentive issue and how you get it right, but also do not jeopardize your shareholders and create what I hope is social contribution from the firm. And so the topic, new normal and executive compensation, we have lots of different perspectives here today. First is that I'd introduce is Yvonne Chen, who works at Pearl Meyer. I have to admit, be fully disclosed, Yvonne gives advice to the board that I am the chairman of. By the way, she works for the board, not for me. About 25 years of advisory efforts with respect to corporate boards and companies with both structuring compensation packages, incentive packages, and how an individual firm would compare and contrast with others in the industry. She really has a broad scope. We're one of her little bitty companies relative to the efforts that she brings to the other. Robert Jackson, who is in the middle, was a deputy to Ken Weinberg. As you know, was the czar with regard to review of compensation in the context of TARP. There were 419 recipients that you reviewed, and something like 17 either got scolded or slapped on the wrist, or I'll let Ron describe how they looked at compensation, and then with respect to how recommendations from Ken and Ron's view about how compensation should be structured going forward. You should know that Ron is a professor of law at Columbia University on this topic and is teaching a class, so he's even better prepared than most because it's right in his wheelhouse. The third is a new guest that we brought tonight is a fellow named William Cohen. He is a former investigative reporter, although I'm not sure that that's really fair. He's an investigative reporter, prize winning, author of House of Cards. This is sort of and just to give you an idea of his point of view, a tale of hubris, wretched excess, and wretched excess on Wall Street. And maybe he didn't think compensation was perfect in Wall Street, and if you follow, he also wrote a great book on Lazard, The Last Tycoons, The Secret History of Lazard Frere. He's actually studied it And just to be fully disclosed, he is now writing a book on the history of Goldman Sachs, which I am, I have to go see my shrink every once in a while to make sure that I'm prepared for reading this treatise when it comes out. You never know how those things turn out. But anyway, Bill has been a real provocateur on compensation. On October 7th, and I would encourage you to read it, in the New York Times, he put forth a point of view that senior management, people like Jon Corzine, in probably the other top 25, in this case he wrote it the top 100, should take on unlimited liability in front of equity holders and debt holders, so that if you mismanage a company, you lose everything, so that you create an analogy with the old partnership format. Bill can describe that more articulately than I can, but it has got a lot of circulation in the system, and when I read his article, I thought it would be most appropriate to have him here as we were talking about compensation, both in a retrospective view and a forward-looking view. And I think there's a lot of merit to the concept. Whether I would want to eat at that table, I'm not sure, but we will, I'm sure Yvonne will
Keep that in mind.
keep that in mind. Anyway, that is the topic. I do want to say that we've had a series of points of view about the financial crisis. I hope that some of you who attended the first know that I believe the structural imbalances in our economy are as much at fault or as much a cause as a lot of the things inside the financial system. Distribution of income in this country has left our middle class deeply impaired, and therefore borrowing and creating a demand for resources that certainly fueled some of the borrowing we saw in mortgages and in the housing market. Certainly a failure to deal with gap on a broader basis in our society, created a culture that we say, okay, and so these are some of the points that I tried to bring out in broad gist. We had two journalists speak to the derivatives issue, which was important, but I think more narrow in some ways than the topic we're talking about tonight. And then we had Secretary Paulson here to give his impressions of circumstances that exist, and particularly as it focuses on moral hazard. But quite frankly, we didn't get to the moral hazard of compensation. Again, if you privatize profits, systems stacked so that people make money off of revenues, but when things go bad, it's the taxpayer or everybody else's problem. Socializing those is really the topic I'd sort of like to get at a little bit here today, and how we build those incentive structures. So everybody's going to talk for 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to your questions. I'm going to take copious notes since I want to know how to incentivize everybody at my youth.
Thanks, John. I think a lot of people have blamed the financial meltdown on excessive pay that's being paid for poor performance, and particularly pay models that incentivize inappropriate risk taking. And there are definitely some real problems. So we've had some real problems, but I think one of the things I feel is contrary to the popular belief, it's often the business model that's broken and not the pay program, or the pay model is following a broken business model. Since I serve as the independent consultant to many public company boards, I thought I'd like to share with you some inside perspective on how boards and compensation committees determine pay, and I think John will want to know that too. And really, that's an important thing to keep in mind, the process, as we think about what's normal for exec comp going forward. The three questions I want to cover are, one, how do boards make pay decisions? And you don't always get to see that firsthand, but I do. I think you've actually seen some of that. Second is, what can go wrong? And I think a lot of things can go wrong. And then thirdly, which is really what you were talking about, is what lessons from the financial market meltdown can be applied across all industries. So what's good not only for the Goldman Sachs of the world, but what works elsewhere. So what happens behind the boardroom? Well, first of all, to start out, boards actually have a legal responsibility for oversight of the pay programs. And that responsibility usually gets delegated to the Compensation Committee. And the Compensation Committee is a subset of the board members. So while management is sometimes in the room, compensation consultant is sometimes in the room, actually the only people who have a vote are the committee members. So as much as people think that, gee, management can influence the committee, maybe, but at the end of the day, CEO doesn't get a vote, I don't get a vote. So what's usually on the agenda? What are they responsible for? Well, for one thing, CEO pay. That's one of the most important things that boards and compensation committees are charged with having oversight of. Secondly, they also take a look at pay for executive officers, and that's not really a fully defined term. It's generally the executive officers of the company, probably the insiders. In practice, what does that mean? In practice, the compensation committee is looking at short-term incentive goals and payouts, so bonuses, if you will. They're looking at long-term incentives and equity awards, stock options, shares. You hear a lot about that. Executive employment agreements. So when you hire somebody from the outside and you want to take them on, sometimes you need to give them an employment agreement. That's something the committee also looks at. And then also, committees are very much charged with taking responsibility for what does a disclosure look like. You've got to sign a little report if you're a committee member that says, gee, I looked at this and this was okay to go ahead and include this in the company's materials. It's important to note that something that's not on the list are the salaries and the incentives for folks below the executive level. Those typically are not on the committee agenda. They're not in the charter. And so that's an area where sometimes we've had problems crop up. So let's say your rogue trader isn't necessarily on the executive list, isn't part of the committee charter. How much time do they spend to do all this? It's really important. Function, well, when we look at research, corporate directors in total spend about 28 days a year per company. And the busy directors for companies that have issues start spending a lot more time than that. But on average, it's about 28 days. And most compensation committees meet maybe 6 or 7 times a year. So it's a lot to cover in maybe 6 or 7 meetings. And I'll tell you, the meetings that I go to range from, say, 1 hour to 4 hours in length. So if you add it all together, it's not a huge amount of time to decide some really important things. When do they have the biggest impact? Well, there are probably 3 critical times a year which are decision points for the committee. And those are the times when the committee really needs to make sure that executive pay and performance are appropriately aligned at each of those 3 decision points. 1, near the beginning of the year, the committee is going to approve the performance goals for the year, and they're going to look at the salary levels usually, and also the target bonus opportunities. So they're determining what's the opportunity and what are you going to do to earn that opportunity. They might also make long-term incentive grants, stock option grants, for example, at the beginning of the year, or maybe later in the year, but it's still generally once a year. The other critical time is after the end of the year. That's when you really see a committee take action, is they're reviewing the performance of the company, of the business units perhaps, of the individual executives, and they're determining what the actual incentive payouts should be by executives. So they're deciding at the end of the day, here was the bonus formula, here's what happened, here's how much Bill should get or Robert should get. And they may, depending on how the plan is designed, be called upon to use their discretion at that point, usually downward, unfortunately, or sometimes upward. So there is some degree, potentially, of discretion at that point. And then finally, there's the third point of touch point, if you will, is periodic. On a periodic basis, the committee is going to think about what's the design of a new incentive plan, or if I have to make changes to an incentive plan model because my business plan has changed. That's a time when a committee is going to make a decision as well. They also should periodically look at the compensation philosophy. What are we paying for? Who are we benchmarking against? That's a critical question that comes up from time to time. Who should our peer companies be? What's that market basket? Because ultimately, I want to know as a committee, does my comp plan fit the business model, and is it competitive with the market? So what's the market? Who are the peer companies? Those are critical decisions. So let's talk a little bit about the second aspect. What can go wrong? This is the process. And ideally, the comp plan should support the business model. And of course, then the business model, hopefully, will in turn drive shareholder value. And that's sometimes where a broken business model can result in a distorted pay program. So for example, if we think about the mortgage lending industry, the business model was in short order to write more mortgages. Let's have more mortgages, because that's how we make money. The executive pay program had in them short-term bonuses that were aligned with revenue growth and EPS growth. And then I would say that at least half of the executive pay came in the form of equity awards, either shares or options. So those were longer-term grants. They vested over a number of years. But below the executive level, you saw something which maybe didn't work so well. It was a different story. You saw employees getting paid for mortgage production, and maybe even quarterly mortgage productions have quarterly bonus to just produce more mortgages. And so where was credit quality and credit control so that we don't make all these horrible loans that blow up when we get into structured finance? Well, that was part of the business process, not part of the compensation process. And as it turned out, in hindsight, that wasn't really enough to withstand a really rapid and severe meltdown. So in the end, the business model fell apart. It wiped out the pay program with it, and along with shareholder value. So you had executives, after the fact, holding equity that was underwater or worthless. And then I think where the problem came out is we didn't anticipate such a big change, and therefore bonuses that were paid, let's say last year, large bonuses for mortgage production, they went home, they took the cash, and then this year the thing fell apart. So we had this sort of disconnect, if you will, between when I was being paid and when the business model fell apart. Admittedly, in my experience, there may be a couple of board members who don't make the full effort to adequately consider consequences of pay programs, but that's pretty rare. When I see problems, they mostly stem from people who are smart, who have really good intentions, but somehow we have a poor decision still occurring. Okay? And one of the issues with that is, do we even have the right people on the board? We have a lot of attention these days on increasing board diversity, on independence, on making sure nobody has any conflicts on the board. And that sometimes means that we don't actually have people who understand the industry on our boards. And particularly, I took a look at some of the AIG and Citigroup, who at the time in 2008 were some of the most complex and maybe most troubled financial services institutions. And in early 2008, only 3 of AIG's 11 independent board members who were up for election that year came out of the financial services industry. So only 3 out of 11. And at the same time, none of the Citigroup directors were from the financial services industry. Of course, the top executives were on the board, and they were right from the industry, but you didn't have other people from the industry on those boards at that time. Of course, since then, they have more people from financial services. But given that kind of expertise, really smart people, a lot of titans of industry on these boards, but given the lack of expertise and then the complexity of the financial products, particularly the AIG derivatives, and the issues that then were at stake, maybe it's unlikely that those directors could have possibly understood those problems enough to take action within the limits of the board member time frame. So if I'm spending 28 days and only 6 or 7 meetings, is that really enough time to understand enough? Surely they were making an effort to become educated about the industry they were on the board, but maybe it's too much to ask for that kind of time commitment. Even when we have the right board members, there can be poor pay decisions. So sometimes I see things, I've been doing this 20 years or so, and you see things that really shouldn't happen and try to keep it from getting derailed. One is incomplete information. So that's something that comes up. You saw that, I think, on the Disney board where they didn't have all the information on, let's say, the Oaths contract going back a couple years. It's not necessarily a deliberate omission. It's just maybe this idea of, gee, just give me the big picture. I only need the big picture because I've only got 28 days to work on this. And so then the crucial detail got missed somewhere in the transaction. We talked a little bit about mismatched time horizons for pay and risk. You had these energy traders being paid annual bonuses, annual cash bonuses on a long-term energy contract, which then unwound and ended up being not so profitable somewhere down the line. There's also this tendency, I find, toward tunnel vision. So, gee, that worked before, let's keep doing that. We don't need to change anything. So we had that for a lot of years in a lot of industries. Gee, everybody had stock options, let's keep doing that. Until maybe that wasn't such a good idea. Now we're, the flavor du jour is let's have performance share. So we keep doing what we have been doing. And then there's also the sort of divergent areas of decision-making being too rushed, so maybe only 6 or 7 meetings. And then I've actually experienced from, interestingly, the owner-founder model, the delayed decision-making, I call it that. This is kind of like the story of the frog that got boiled slowly in the water and didn't jump out because it slowly raised the temperature a little bit by a little bit. I once had a client in a medical-related industry. They took years to finally push out their owner, founder, CEO, who was over 70 years old at the time. And it wasn't so much that he was over 70 years old, is that he'd sort of gone off a bit and was very difficult to work with and a very difficult leader. Even though it was a really tough decision, because this is a high owner, a founder, and he founded the company, by the time he left, the committee had, with reluctance, approved a big pension for him and also for his secretary. So that clearly didn't really work very well, but it took them a while to solve the problem. If I think about the other issue that we suffer from as compensation professional is that I get told a lot of times, well, you should have known, you could have done, right? So hindsight is 20/20. I think very few people predicted the timing and severity of the recession. I would say that similarly, not all poor pay decisions were obviously wrong when they were being made. And then finally, when I think about board members and directors and where we're going with the new normal for executive compensation, particularly what lessons from the financial services industry can be applied across industries, that's something which is really to be defined, but certainly the board members that I deal with are very keenly aware that starting in 2011, all of this has evolved to the point where shareholders are going to have their own opportunity to tell the board that the pay model is broken through these say-on-pay advisory votes. So as shareholders, you'll be able to, on your proxy, say, yes, I do or don't like the pay programs of the company if you're a shareholder. And at the end of the day, we'll see whether 50% of the shareholders voted for the pay model or 100%. Or worse yet, there were 3 companies where less than 50% voted for their pay model. So that was Motorola, Occidental, and KeyCorp. So that's something that board members are very keenly aware of. In my view, I think there's some basic lessons that I took from the financial services industry in terms of the pay models, in terms of aligning pay with shareholders. I think one is very, very much more focus on balancing the pay and the business risk. So not only the amount of risk, but also the time frame for the risk and the timing of the payouts. Another is to make sure that you're stress testing the pay model under a really wide range of scenarios. So all kinds of both upside and downside outliers. I mean, a lot of focus on threshold, target, max, but really didn't think about, well, gee, if everybody in the lower level of the mortgage industry was writing these bad mortgages, then what happens? The other is, I would say, and I think you've heard this, I think that I, as a professional, and others need to be very careful about when and if you ever use uncapped annual cash bonuses. Because there were certainly some instances where you had a lot of money coming out of those bonuses, and then the result was somewhere down the road and not quite as positive as you thought. I think one example was a $100 million bonus for some trader. I think the next couple of things really just keep aligning executive compensation with long-term performance, not quarterly results. There's a lot of pressure. I think you as a CEO get this every quarter. Oh, what did Jon deliver in earnings this quarter? It's really important to have that long-term alignment. And then finally, and we get lots of help from Congress and the SEC on this one, is to provide more transparency through better disclosure. And I don't mean more pages of disclosure in our legal documents. I mean better, more clear disclosure, more concise disclosure. And I would say my co-panelist, Robert, is really in a unique position to tell us about how things went wrong in the financial services industry and why the pay models were broken. And then, Bill, I think you've actually written a lot about what the pay model should be to make executive owners, to make it work better. So.
Thanks very much. I guess, as Yvonne mentioned, it's helpful to start with a sense for what I was doing in this area during the financial crisis. As I mentioned during the introduction, I was the deputy to Ken Weinberg, who was the pay czar. And we helped to set compensation at 7 very large financial institutions that received extraordinary government assistance, as opposed from run-of-the-mill government assistance. And we engaged in a broader review of compensation practices at other firms. And it might be helpful to start with just a touch of background about me. So, with apologies to the undergrads who might be here, I went to college and business school down the street at Penn. And I studied finance there. So the idea that I might become a deputy pay czar and arrive in the boardrooms that Yvonne is describing and say the dreaded phrase, "I'm from the government and here to help you," strikes me, and let me assure you, especially my parents, who funded my education, it's very disappointing and very surprising. And I want to say that most of the processes that Yvonne has described in the run-of-the-mill cases, in the typical cases, works. But there are reasons why it didn't at the peak of the crisis. And I want to just give you a couple of sort of takeaway thoughts for what I found during my experience as to why it might not have, and then what you can think about in terms of signals as to what we're going to see going forward. And so what I first start with is just to point out that during the time the compensation committees at these financial institutions were setting pay during the crisis, they were focused, as Yvonne described, on a very limited set of individuals, CEOs and other top executives at the top of the house of these firms. Now, the mandate that Ken Weinberg and I got from Congress was a different mandate. They said, set compensation for the 100 most highly paid individuals at these firms, in addition to folks at the top of the house. Now, that should strike you a little bit as very different from the project Yvonne just described in 2 ways. First is, it was enormous, right? So 100 individuals, the most highly paid folks, not just the executives. So a much broader enterprise. We had to do this for 7 firms: AIG, Citigroup, Bank of America, Chrysler, GM, and both of their financing arms. This is 700 employees or so that we're setting pay for. This is the work of at least a medium-sized consulting firm on a full-time basis, and we had 8 people in the basement of the Treasury Department. So one thing that we went into the process with was a great deal of humility for the process that had already been established. We knew that compensation committees were already doing good work. What we tried to add on the margin was to get them to think hard about the assumptions they'd been making for a long time about how to set pay at public companies. So I'll start with the difference between the folks Yvonne talked about, executive officers, and the rest of the people in the firm. Now, you might remember, for those of you who read a lot during the financial crisis, the employees at a little subsidiary in Connecticut of AIG called AIG Financial Products. These are the individuals who wrapped financial products in extensive insurance arrangements that ended up causing AIG very significant losses. The number of executive officers at AIG Financial Products is 0. So none of the compensation rules, none of the disclosure regulations, none of the processes Yvonne has described to you so far apply to any of these folks. And when we went to the compensation committee at AIG and asked about that, we said, well, what do you think about the compensation structures? How are they doing? They said, well, they're not executive officers. They're not in our purview. Now, that's an understandable answer in many ways. For many years, the compensation committee function was limited to those top folks. And what they really said was there's somebody who's in charge of that, whose pay we do set, and we assume if we get that guy's pay right, he'll get the rest of it right. And we said, we think maybe not. We think there's lots of room for error, and that even small differences in incentives can make a big difference when you're talking about $1 trillion in notional value of insurance products. So we want you to rethink that kind of an assumption. Something else we really got the companies to rethink, and you'll talk a little bit about this. There's this notion that employees really need certainty in compensation. That if you make employees take risk in the value of the company, they'll balk. This is an appealing idea for anybody who does economics, right? Because we think that individuals are risk averse, and all things equal, you have to pay them to take risk. So if I say to an employee, you can have $1 of cash or $1 of stock, he'll say, I'll take the cash, thanks. And I'll invest it however I like. To take stock, you're going to need to give me $1.20 or $1.50. So you would have thought that when we arrived on the scene and said to the top executives of Citigroup and AIG and GM and Chrysler, you've got to take lots of your pay in stock, they would have fled en masse. But actually, it's not what happened. What we discovered in our work, in my work with Ken Feinberg, was that when we said to the employees, we want you to take risk in the stock of the company, they took it as a challenge. They thought it was a good bet, actually. And by the way, for the record, many of them at AIG have turned out to be right. They thought they were willing to take a gamble on their company's future fortunes, and 85% of the people who we set pay for last year in October, around this time last year, are still in their chairs working for these institutions right now. Again, that's a critical assumption that compensation committees have been working on for a long time, that we just asked them to rethink. And when they did, they came to a very different set of conclusions about the way they thought about compensation. I'll give one more example. When we were working with AIG, a compensation consultant, a highly respected compensation consultant, came in and said, you know, we're having a hard time finding really comparable pay for the CEO of one of their insurance divisions. The reason is it's so big, it could be its own public company. So we think he should be paid more or less like the CEO of a public company. And they gave us all kinds of big figures for the way you pay CEOs of very large insurance companies. And we said, yeah, but he's not the CEO of a public company. He's actually not even junior to the CEO of a public company. He's like 3 rungs down where the CEO of a public company would be. So we want you to rework this analysis based on this kind of rethinking about the way you think about how you set compensation. And they came back with numbers, you can imagine, that are much, much lower. So when we got them to sort of rethink these assumptions, these don't seem like hard questions, I know, but in boardrooms of US public companies, there were unusual things to say and ask. We found that it was not that hard to get to very, very different decisions about compensation than the companies had reached before we got involved. The other thing I think we did well with Ken is we thought very hard about what to do about risk. So Yvonne talked a little bit about these high-level principles like that are important, that we should align compensation with risk-taking. That's absolutely right, of course, but hard to do in practice. I mean, when you ask what that means, that's a very difficult thing to put one's finger on. I'll give you an example of what we did. So in general, you'd think that giving the executives of financial institutions stock in the company is a good thing. And I do too. And the reason is they're putting their own money on the table and taking real risk, and if the company doesn't perform, the shares will be worth less and they'll get paid less. We think that's generally good. That's true, but in financial institutions we have a big problem that John described at the outset, which is that the gains are largely privatized and the losses socialized. So if you make the CEO or other top executives a very, very large stockholder and nothing else, like other stockholders, they privatize gains. Like other stockholders, their losses are socialized. And that might be really troubling from a social point of view. So at AIG, we struck an unusual kind of balance. We gave them lots of stock because there has all kinds of laudable things, but we also gave them debt securities of the company on the theory that we wanted to be sure that if the debt we were holding as a Treasury Department fell in value, the executives would suffer some losses because so would the taxpayers, and we thought that was important. So this is all a way of saying that over time, US public companies have kind of gotten themselves in a place where a set of assumptions that work, that are accepted, that are really rather biblical at this point, needed to be questioned and rethought. And one of the things that Ken Feinberg did so well at these very few companies that he had a special mandate to supervise was to reset some of that thinking. Now, that opens the question that's posed by today's panel, which is, what is the new normal? And I have to say, the experience of being the government representative in the US public company boardroom was so totally terrifying that I hope it was totally unique. That is, it was strange for me to be sitting there and saying, I'm here from the government and we're going to sit in the boardroom and observe your business decisions. It was terrifying, not just because, not that I thought it was inappropriate that we should do it, of course it wasn't, but it seemed like not quite the right role for a government shareholder to be playing. And to me, this is all a way of saying that what the new normal will be in executive compensation will depend fundamentally on leadership from firms. There are a lot of ideas out there right now on executive compensation. And I can talk, if you'd like, about Dodd-Frank and the important changes it makes, and the Federal Reserve, which is doing a close review of compensation structures. But what history teaches us is that it's firms themselves, it's the market, that pushes individuals towards new thinking about the way they should structure risk and the way they should be compensated for taking risk. And I'm actually quite hopeful that we're going to see some of those changes in firms in the coming months and years. I'd like to hear my co-panelists' views about that. But I think I'd encourage everybody to think of this very unique time during the financial crisis as limited in its usefulness, except insofar as it caused us to step back and rethink the fundamental assumptions in American finance that had gone quite wrong, and gives us a bit of a blank slate to start with in terms of thinking about what we might do next.
Okay, well, thank you, Governor Corzine, for allowing me to speak in this august auditorium. So, one thing that Governor Corzine didn't mention was that before becoming a writer about Wall Street, I spent 17 years on Wall Street as an M&A banker at some firms far less distinguished than Goldman Sachs. So my experience may not be quite as profound as it might have been had I worked at Goldman Sachs, but I did compete with Goldman Sachs regularly, and so I know a little bit about Wall Street compensation. I'm a beneficiary of Wall Street compensation system. So I think it's important that you know that as a beneficiary of Wall Street compensation system and the incentives that are created on Wall Street, I have given a lot of time over the last 6 years since I left Wall Street and became a writer about Wall Street as to how it all works, why people on Wall Street do what they do. And if you think about, as I do, when I got to Wall Street was in September of 1987. A month later came October of 1987, which, looking out on this side of the room, I know nobody there knows what happened in October 87, but this 2/3 I'm feeling pretty good. Might know something about what happened in October of 87. The stock market crashed 22.6% in one day. I'd been on Wall Street all of a month. I saw grown men cry in front of the Quotron machines. That's what we used to have in those days. People didn't have desktop computers with streaming Ameritrade, TV Ameritrade quotes or whatever. That little kid in the crib wasn't talking about having real-time quotes on his iPhone. And vowing that they would never let what happened then happen again. And so my experience was, and then there was, of course, a very thick, 1.5 inch thick document, the Brady Commission, which sort of looked at what went wrong in the crash of '87 and why that happened and how to prevent it from happening again. And so my experience was colored by that moment. And then over the next 17 years that I was on Wall Street, the idea was that we would never let this happen again. And the only thing that happened was that just about every other year there was a financial crisis of some sort on Wall Street, and that as over the course of those 17 years had greater and greater repercussions for our society as a whole. And so once upon a time when Wall Street was a relatively innocuous part of our society where, and I don't have the exact figures, but it may be a relatively small percentage of our GDP. At the height of the crisis, it was something like 40%, and we all know that we're living with the ramifications now of the collapse or the near collapse of that system. So I've asked myself, what is the common denominator of these crises? What is it has been bringing it all together? What is it why has there been this desire, this outspoken promise by our leaders, by the leaders on Wall Street, our leaders in government, never to let these types of things happen again, and yet they seem to happen with regularity. And so the more I thought about it, the more I came to the conclusion, maybe it's too reductionist, but nevertheless, I'm still waiting to be somebody who has worked on Wall Street to really and who understands the compensation system and the motivations to dissuade me from my view, which is obviously a very dangerous thinking that I'm engaging in. But nevertheless, I feel pretty good about it, and that is that once upon a time, Wall Street was a series of small, undercapitalized private partnerships. There were a lot of private partnerships. There were a lot of Wall Street firms. Most people never even heard of any of them. Most people had zero interaction with them. They were in the business of doing things that were very important, actually, for capitalism, which was providing capital to companies that were trying to grow on a 24/7 basis, or at that point it was sort of more like 9 to 3:30 or something basis. Sort of in the United States, and where capitalism was prevalent in Western Europe, but now basically it's evolved into a 24/7 all over the globe allocation of capital to those people who really need it at very particular points in time, and that is an incredibly valuable service that Wall Street provides for its clients. And the other thing that Wall Street did was provide advice on mergers or acquisitions, which is what I did for 17 years, or on investment advice. So, so if you look at the sort of history of Wall Street from its beginning under the Buttonwood Tree series of private partnerships until about 1970, when this firm that was very sort of highly regarded but considered an upstart, named Donaldson Lufkin Gendret, one day showed up at the New York Stock Exchange governor's meeting in 1970, and I think Dan Lufkin announced that to the governors of the New York Stock Exchange, this really private club, that DLJ, he had the prospectus in his bag, was about to file it with the SEC, and DLJ was going to go public. The very day, I think, that was Dan Lufkin's first meeting as a governor of the New York Stock Exchange, and Gus Levy, who was, of course, was a famous partner at Goldman Sachs, and Felix Rohatyn, who was a famous partner at Lazard, where I worked for a long time. I think they wanted to take Dan Lufkin out and decapitate him the moment he walked in with this prospectus, because they knew that it was going to change everything on Wall Street, and it absolutely did, because you went from a culture on Wall Street of a series of private partnerships where partners had their capital, their own personal capital at risk, where they were personally liable for the behavior of their fellow partners. They were personally liable up to their entire net worth, for at least a long time until they changed that structure, but up to a great amount of their net worth for the behavior of their fellow partners. So any losses would get distributed throughout the partnership, and of course the profits would also get shared throughout the partnership. And as a result, Wall Street was a very dangerous place. Firms were going in and out of business all the time. Firms were generally undercapitalized because it was their partners' money. They would take crazy risks that they probably shouldn't do. Goldman Sachs in 1929, 1930 almost went out of business. It was not the first time they went out of business. It wasn't going to be the last time they almost went out of business. But basically, by being a private partnership, these firms were very, very focused on what their partners did and the risks they were taking. I think this partnership culture is one of the reasons Goldman Sachs was able to weather the crisis as well as it did compared to other firms, because they still thought very much like partners, and they still had a group of 300 to 400 of their senior executives who get paid out of the pre-tax profits of the firm. But unfortunately, what happened was DLJ led a stampede of firms going public, and a change in the whole culture on Wall Street from a partnership culture to a bonus culture. And I think beginning in 1970 with DLJ, in 72, Merrill Lynch went public, Bear Stearns went public in 85, Morgan Stanley went public in 86, Goldman Sachs did what Governor Corzine had been pushing them for many years to do, finally in 1999. And even Lazard, the venerable 150, 60-year-old private French partnership went public in May of 2005. And basically all firms on Wall Street are now public. So what did that do? It changed from a partnership culture where partners were motivated to monitor what their partners were doing, to focus on the profitability of the firm as a whole, and therefore the risks that the firm was taking as a whole, to a bonus culture where people got rewarded for generating revenues. And whatever the hot new product was, that's what people on Wall Street would sell. Because Wall Street is nothing if not a massive selling machine. It's and caveat emptor. The problem is that everybody forgets that. And so that you have a system of these armies of salesmen who take whatever the latest, greatest product is, and they sell it, and they sell it, and they sell it, and they don't know when to stop. And they only stop when the bubble inflates, and then the bubble explodes. And that's why we had the crisis in '87, because that was a junk bond-related crisis. We had the internet bubble in 2000 and 2001, because that was, Wall Street had created this, great idea of bringing public companies where you didn't have to have any revenues, you didn't have to have any profits, you didn't have to have any people, you just have to have eyeballs looking at an internet screen. And then in 2005, 2006, in 2007, we had the bubble that got inflated because of mortgage-backed securities and this great new product that was created at Salomon Brothers in the early 80s about securitizing cash flow streams of mortgages, and among others. And, Wall Street gets these infatuations with these products that they create, and since they're rewarded to sell them, and to keep selling them, and to keep selling them, and to keep selling them, and it's inevitable each one of these times that they do this, the credit quality deteriorates, but they keep selling because that's what they're rewarded to do. So my solution, which was the governor mentioned in this New York Times article in October that I followed up a few weeks ago with another piece where I said I don't understand why people on Wall Street get paid as much as they do, and frankly I don't understand that at all. I've never understood that. Is that these people who make the decisions, you're never going to unscramble the egg and make public companies back into private partnerships, but you need to have people at the top of these firms who are making decisions about who to promote, who to fire, what business lines to be in, where to allocate capital. These people, which I have loosely described as the top 100 people at these firms, which seems about right. I mean, Goldman Sachs has 34,000 people. J.P. Morgan Chase has 200,000 plus people. The top 100 people of these firms are the ones making these decisions, and these are the people who should have real skin in the game again, who have everything at risk or thereabouts, to make sure that people are paying attention, so we don't just get this bonus culture where people are encouraged to generate as much revenue as they can based on the latest product that they're asked to sell without any accountability or consequences whatsoever. And I think that if that were to happen, again, it's a hypothesis, but it's based on the reality of the way Wall Street used to work when things were kind of relatively calm. After the 1933 Act and the 1934 Act, that period of time until till the late 70s, early 80s, was a period of relative calm on Wall Street. And I think the reason is because the compensation structure aligned people to be very, very focused on the risks they were taking and not to be rewarded for what I call asynchronous risk, which is where the people on Wall Street get rewarded to take big risks with other people's money, and there's no accountability whatsoever for their behavior.
Well, I don't know about all of you, but for a CEO who would be one of those 100, I think it's a provocative and good idea. As someone who worked in a partnership for most of my career as opposed to compensation, I would say that I have a lot of sympathy with the general idea that the managers or the people who make the choices have more skin in the game than they do today, although some might argue that you have a lot of skin in the game if you own a lot of stock in the company that you manage. But I think the real nux of the question, and I'd pose this more as a question to the folks here, is that Wall Street got off of the idea of wealth creation into compensation as the driving incentive. You can have your kind of concept, Bill, or some, even having AIG executives taking on debt as well as equity, so that if they make bad decisions, then the debt is lost, all seem to me to be pointing towards finding a system that talks about creating wealth and losing it, by the way, that's a two-sided equation, being the essence of how we might get better decision-making. But I think it would be hard to refute what Bill has suggested, what Ron has seen, and what Yvonne is trying to counsel me to make sure that we don't do, is you create a system that is designed to produce revenues and not profits, to produce short-term gain, not long-term thinking. And I think your description, Bill, is accurate. The kinds of ideas where people who are not in management are making more than management because they're getting paid as a percentage of revenues, not profits, is a major, major problem. I was talking to Yui earlier, you know, of some of those same characteristics in the healthcare system, where people are not looking at the whole cloth, and I think we need to be working towards that. But isn't it really about wealth creation? Doesn't that get it, or loss? Doesn't that get at solving this problem as opposed to focusing strictly on the partnership concept, if you will? Bill, start with you, and then.
Well, I think that, you know, Wall Street's really lost its way in the last, I don't know, 40 years. I mean, it happens to coincide.
That's when we started.
Yeah, well, it happened to coincide with, you know, the DLJ going public. But I think that that these are now public companies that nowhere else, no other company on the face of the earth, no other big public company on the face of the earth pays out between, used to be 50 and 60% of every dollar of revenue into the form of compensation. Now, firms like to pretend it's 40 to 50%, but there's still plenty that pay between 50 and 60%. So who do these firms really exist for? I mean, they're public companies. They have public debt holders. They have public creditors. They have public shareholders. I mean, Goldman's market cap is, what, 90 billion, 100 billion? So that's a lot of equity value out there that people are betting on, that shareholders hope will come to them, right? It's their company. But if you pay out 50% of every dollar of revenue in the form of compensation to the employees, and that's what it's all about, and people are making, you know, a lot of money. Let's face it, in no other profession on the face of the earth are people making this much money. As I said the other day, you know, why should a financial engineer get paid 100 times more than a real engineer? But that's exactly what's happening, and as a result, you have to be an idiot, I think, really, to not see the attraction of that, especially in a capitalist society. So that's why the best and the brightest of our society is, you know, it's like a black hole. It's sucking all these smart people to Wall Street. And why? Of course they would go there, because that's where they can make the most money in the least period of time. So who do these firms exist for? Why do they exist in this way? Why do they get paid so much money? What kind of society are we building here? You know, we were talking on the way down about how we've lost our manufacturing base in this country. We've become a service-oriented society. I mean, maybe that's the high, you know, Maslow's needs hierarchy. I don't remember service-oriented society at the top of the chain, but maybe, you know, Maslow should rewrite it and talk about that, because that seems to be what we've evolved in. But it is, I think that these problems that we've had, these bubbles that Wall Street has created in the last 25 years have all been, you know, basically at the creation of Wall Street. They were all preventable, but they weren't prevented because the incentives were wrong. It's only afterwards that you look at the problems that they created, vow never to do it again, and then hope for things will go away and get back to the status quo as quickly as possible. That's what, with all due respect, I think, Hank Paulson did when he was Treasury Secretary, along with Mr. Bernanke and Geithner. They wanted to reestablish the status quo as quickly as possible. And guess what? They've done it for Wall Street. Wall Street's going to pay out by the way, you let me get going. $145 billion of compensation is going to be paid out this year to Wall Street. And we've got, 10% unemployment in the rest of the country. That doesn't seem fair.
Ron and Yvonne.
So let me just say, just to put a fine point on how right that is, and why your piece has such traction. The fact that Wall Street pays the way it does is it's a Wall Street problem for sure, but it's like a social problem, right? Because of that fact, the folks on the right side of the room who are brilliant aren't going to be doctors. On the margin, they're going to choose to be bankers, like you did, like I did. And the reason is that we can add. And we see that the compensation over the short term is enormously more attractive. I can't blame you for it. I teach economics. It's straightforward, right? So it's actually a very broad social problem. And more than that, it's a problem that's worse in magnitude than we were talking about. Because when we say they pay half their revenues out in comp, revenue has a different meaning on Wall Street than it does to all of us, right? So to all of us, we sell a widget. It costs $3. Our revenues are $3. Wall Street sells a financial product. It's a 30-year security that yields 10 basis points greater than the comparable security. But it does it for 30 years. So we add up those 30 years, we discount the present value to today, and that's today's revenues. And I want half of that, please. So there's no doubt, actually, that this is a very troubling culture. I think John's right that the way to fix it is to focus on value creation or wealth creation over the long term. But of course, the tricky part is, and the challenge I had at Treasury is, how do you measure that? How do you do that? And as appealing as I find the idea of making partners put their capital at stake again, I'm concerned about a regime like the one that's been described, because we have 10% unemployment. And in a regime where the executives of banks have to worry about losing their house when they make bad bets, I think they're going to make fewer bets. And that's not a good situation to have where you've got 10% unemployment. And so all of this, to me, is a question about striking a balance between the terribly abusive short-term bonus culture that has been described absolutely accurately, that has all of these very significant social and economic costs, but also to balance those considerations with the very profound need to have financial institutions that match risk takers to risk taking. And something I'd say that was a strange experience for me at Treasury as an academic, I'm happy to, I've written about this, and I'm glad to conclude that these institutions don't do a good job at setting pay. And one of my papers is about how private equity firms set CEO compensation. So ask Henry Kravis, who's got his own skin in the game when KKR buys a firm, how he sets CEO pay. Totally different than the way the board of directors sets CEO pay in a public company. Totally different, and that tells us something, I think. But what I struggle with is a world in which we need to have financial institutions matching risk with risk takers. And over the last year or so down in Washington, the word risk has become like a bad word. That's an extremely dangerous thing for an economy in which capitalist growth is predicated on the taking of risk. And so what I'd say is, as right as everything that's been said is, and as important as it is to focus on wealth creation, that cuts both ways. That is, we should be wary of systems like this that reward short-term risk-taking, but we should be equally wary of systems that deny capital to an economy that's starving for it. I think this time in particular is something that's always on my mind.
I actually get asked a lot about wealth creation. So every time the committee's making a long-term decision about what to do, there's this question of, so what's the ultimate wealth creation? What's our tally sheet? What is the full possibility that this will be a lot or a little when we get out a bunch of years? This happens a lot when you get into pension decisions in particular. So you have people, gee, we have a little tiny tweak in this year's pension formula, and it plays out over years and years, and then you've got somebody retiring with a $100 million pension at the end of the day. So wealth creation is something that we do think about. One of the issues that comes into play, though, I think particularly in the Wall Street arena, is that we have a mobility of talent. So I might tell somebody, stick it out. We've got this great wealth creation program for you. It'll make you very wealthy if you perform well and you don't take undue risk for the next 10 years, that person says, that's fine, but Joan over here is going to pay me, today, and I can just go over there. And, whole departments have moved from firm to firm. Gee, I had a bad year here, I'm going to go over here. Next year I had a bad year here, I'm going to go over here. So you have a lot of mobility, not only in sort of these trading groups, but also the average CEO tenure is maybe only about 4 years or so at this point. It's unusual. Some of the larger companies I do see somebody with 40 years of tenure. It's unusual to see that now. And so the idea of wealth creation is a short-term idea as opposed to a long-term idea. And I have a couple of examples now where I have a CEO who's been there for a while. They're retiring at an inopportune moment. The market is low, and they're still there asking me, so what about my wealth creation? I should have had a lot of wealth creation, but my stock price is low. Why don't I have the right amount of wealth creation? So it's an idea that's there. I think it's a little bit of a paradigm shift. It's like when, I think Goldman might have been first to say, gee, you used to get all this cash compensation. That's very silly. Why are we paying all this cash to people going in and out of the elevators every day? We ought to make some percentage of that translated into stock options or shares. And the first person to do that took a big risk. The first company to do that took a big risk that all their people would say, this is a bad deal. I can get all cash over there. So it's a paradigm shift to start thinking about, gee, we're not looking at this year's bonus or 3 years. We're looking at 10 years. One of the programs in its heyday that worked the best from general industry was the old GE model, where your compensation got deferred, and the deferred amounts were in GE stock, which at the time, for years, did very well until recently. And it was impossible to recruit someone out of GE without paying them a lot of money because they couldn't walk with those shares. If they walked, the interest accrual on those shares would go back down to like a prime rate instead of the GE stock rate. So they had a long-term wealth creation program that worked really well for a lot of years, and then came, the denouement.
Why don't I open it up to questions, please? Please.
What would be the effect on the financing of American industry if the highest tax bracket were 92% as it was under President Eisenhower? Would there be any less financing of American industry in that situation? Because that would certainly affect compensation.
Well, I think a lot of executives would be very, very concerned about that tax bracket. We have, of course, a slight increase in taxes going into 2011, and in the UK we have a much higher tax bracket, and I have to tell you, I've got a lot of folks calling me and saying, what can I do about this? I'd have to honestly say, do I think they work less hard? No, I think if you said this is the government regulation and this is what you're getting, I don't think they work less hard because it applies to everybody. But you would have people, let's say, going into a hedge fund and say, oh, I want that carried interest program that isn't yet taxed at that level. I have a lot of, especially CFOs, who say, well, when I retire, I want to go be a private equity guy or a hedge fund guy.
I don't want
Would
to. I don't want
industry
to.
be financed any less?
I don't want to get off on a tangent because this could dominate the whole conversation. But people who sit in CEOs' chairs would figure out how to tax arbitrage. They'd be in Geneva or Hong Kong or someplace else if you went. There's some level of indifference between marginal tax rates, but 92% versus 40% leads to a lot of different kinds of behaviors that would not be good.
But would American industry be financed any less in that situation? That's my
Well, I think the demand would be less. It would aggravate the direction we're already taking, which is because of differentials in costs of inputs into manufacturing. We have a hard time competing as it is.
I mean, good. There's actually good. Just to bring it back to the compensation discussion, there's a good example. We know this. We have a good example. Last year, the French and English decided to tax banker bonuses an additional 50%. Right? So they said, we're just going to, you pay a bonus, we're just going to tax an additional 50%. Generally, we've done a number of econometric studies about what happened there. What happened is the banks continue to pay the bonuses, right? Shareholders pay the payroll tax. This makes the cost of equity capital for banks more expensive. This makes it more difficult to give capital to private industry. And this, generally is expected to reduce GDP growth over time.
4 or 5 major hedge funds moved to Geneva.
Yeah, exactly. I think.
Sir?
Governor, we've learned so much in looking at hindsight and everything that's happened, and yet it's puzzling that the taxpayer bill from TARP is nothing compared to Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac. And it's been well documented for about the past 6 years that those subprime and all-day loans that went in there are the cause of the bubble. Why is no attention being paid to that?
Well, I don't want to preempt anybody else. I think that the reason is there is not an obvious alternative solution that works today. Since Fannie Mae and Freddie Mac's debt securities are held broadly by foreign central banks across the globe, and if you were to pull government support away from those institutions at the moment, and debt holders were held responsible for the bad decisions that led to the failure of the two institutions, you'd have an international financial crisis that I don't think anyone thinks is acceptable. Now, in conservatorship, which is where Fannie and Freddie are, they are now being regulated to a fairly well. They're not building their portfolios, they're actually shrinking their portfolios. They're doing plain vanilla stuff, not doing, they should have had that kind of regulator on them before, and maybe you wouldn't have had the facilitation of those kinds of efforts. But I think the real issue of why it isn't being addressed is you've got, I don't know, probably a quarter of the national debt, don't hold me to the exact number, of Freddie and Fannie securities stuffed into the Bank of China, the institutions across the globe. And so I think they're making a pragmatic decision as they wind down those debt holdings abroad, which will happen in its due course runoff. I think then there will be a restructuring. But I think it's 3-4 years away. Even though people are going to hoot and holler about it, it's a nice political argument to talk about on the campaign trail. It's not practical for anybody to walk away from those guarantees today. I don't know if anybody else is.
Yeah, no, I would give a similar answer to the governor. I mean, my gut reaction, the 30-second reaction, is that you're talking about two different problems of completely different orders of magnitude. I mean, on the one hand, you're looking at TARP assistance, which, for the largest bank was, 25 to 35 billion of preferred stock. Not to say that that's change, of course, but that's what the TARP involved. And typically, it was a liquidity investment where we took preferred and said, when your marks come back, you'll be in a position to redeem this preferred. The problem we're talking about at Freddie and Fannie is a problem exceeding the $3 trillion problem. It requires a much more systemic solution than we could do with TARP.
By the way, there were a lot of places that took TARP money not because they wanted TARP money. Matter of fact, I think Wells Fargo fought like hell to avoid it. They were ongoing concerns, but the policy decision, probably rightly, was that put money into everybody so that you didn't prejudice the slow deer that were in trouble, and therefore when places that were successful wanted to sell that stuff, get out of TARP, sell their preferreds and other things, it was actually pretty attractive for investors, and so they bought it, and actually the Treasury's done okay. I mean, it had a second benefit from the fact that good institutions ended up diversifying their shareholder base when they sold it. You're going to see that in GM now. Not that it didn't need restructuring, but they're going to sell that at a price that is actually going to improve. You've seen it with AIG and other things. Some of that's cyclical, but some of it is the structuring that went into it from the start. But you can't do that with Fannie and Freddie because that was just, it was a bad business model to start with.
I'm going to direct my question to Robert Jackson. In your statement, you have a sense of optimism about the fact that you sat on these boards and you were under the impression that you thought in the future executives would be willing to change the overall compensation model to reduce the disconnect between privatized because when you think that in your position as a government employee, essentially, breathing down their necks, everybody is going to say, oh yes, this looks great, especially when it's still, 24 months out. But 10 years from now, 20 years from now, and it's still going to have that same social function. What kind of shift do you think would require that to happen?
So where does my optimism about change come from?
Yes.
Yeah. I'm extremely naive. So I think this is a hard thing to explain or to put one's finger on analytically. I wonder whether my colleagues on the panel will agree with me. I think a lot of the mistakes that were made around compensation of financial institutions, some of them were mistakes about short-termism and lack of vision, but others were mistakes around path dependency. Right? So Wall Street developed a culture, a way of doing things, and so did executive compensation committees generally, consultants and others sort of developed a stock set of recommendations and approaches and procedures. And when that happens in a narrow social setting, people tend to have a set of fixed expectations about what we should do and why. Those things are hard to change when they develop over long periods of time. And we develop a certain set of biases when those things tend to appear, even in short-term hindsight, to have been successful. And so the reason I'm optimistic is that what's happened over the last year or two has shown that they weren't successful. That is, you can be a banker with short-term interest, and you can be greedy and all the things that people generally associate bankers with. But in my experience, bankers are smart, thoughtful people who want to get things right. And when I talk to the folks at Goldman or Morgan Stanley or Citi or elsewhere, they're a little astonished and a little upset that they missed it so badly, and they want to get it right. And that doesn't mean that they will, right? There's all kinds of competitive pressures, Yvonne and others have described, that will push them away from sort of social considerations. But my hope, and where my optimism comes from, is that the events of the last year or two will show them how profoundly they were wrong and persuade them to try and get it right. And when I said in my comments that I thought firm leadership would be important, it's going to take something like a Goldman or somebody else to step forward and say, we think we got this wrong, we want to fix it, and here's how we're going to do it. Because if they don't do something like that, then competitive pressures will push people away from it. I think I want to just add very quickly is that a challenge we have here is, your question hints toward, is keeping people's eye on this ball. So one challenge we're having is with the Federal Reserve, who's implementing standards on compensation. And the Federal Reserve spends a great deal of time with banks and monitors closely what they're doing on incentives. And I think it's going to be very, very important to get them to say a lot about what they're doing and how it's changing, because, as you say, this is a sort of a collective action problem. And so you'll need someone like the Federal Reserve to be sure that they're moving banks in the right direction over time. And the way to get them to do that, I think, is to get them to be very transparent about exactly what they're doing when they talk to banks about these questions. But my guess is, in the long run, you'll see fixes. Now, there are good reasons to think from Wall Street's history that maybe it'll take time, and maybe they'll be stubborn. But my guess is that over time they'll want to get this closer to right, and that they'll learn from the last couple of years that they had a lot of these decisions quite wrong.
Dr. Reiner?
Yes, I serve on boards, although not on a compensation committee, that's on that, I don't know why, the executive. But you're in a real dilemma. In the short run, you can hold your nose, but even if you think all American executives are overpaid, I believe that's in general true, you've got to pay what the competition pays, or you might lose the executive. I sometimes think we should, as board members, take more risk and say, you want to walk? Walk. Because there's 5 people beneath you, probably just as good, and one I know is better than you, but we never have the guts to do this. So we pay these people, and if somebody trashes a company and really doesn't either create social value or value for the shareholder, they're still very, very well paid, more than any physician could ever dream of getting paid. If they do very well, they get even more rich. And then from year to year, this goes up. So it used to be executives got, 45%, 45 times what average employees, and now it's over 400, depending on how you count it. And Ms. Chen, I hate to say, your industry was instrumental in driving that. And it's almost mathematics that drives it, because here's how that goes. You have these benefit consultants, And they come in with this consulting report of reference CEOs who already are carefully picked. They come in, and then you have a frequency distribution. You have a median and the 75th percentile, et cetera. Now, no corporation says, we're going to pay the median because our guy is mediocre. So we're doing 75th. 90 is greedy, 75th is good. So everyone goes 75th. Guess what happens to that frequency distribution a year down the pike?
Absolutely.
The whole thing has shifted, and what was 75 this year is median next year. And that is how it is that a great country like ours drove executives to make 500 times or 400 times of the average employee, wonders why its income distribution is so skewed, wonders why what it does to the political process, wonders what it does to the social fabric of this country. And I would hate to say, but the executive compensation industry was a crucial part in that inflationary drive. And at some point, I really think the best thing that happened is that we now have to disclose to the SEC. It's a complicated form, but at least people know. And you know what? It makes us nervous. I really, it's the saddest part of my board service. Much of it has been just wonderful, but the saddest part is executive compensation, because every time I go home, holding my nose.
Ron, you got it.
Two things.
Absolutely correct.
Two things. One, I've probably got 15, 20 clients. Not one, not a single one is targeting 75th. They all target the median for median performance, and if they're performing below median, then the boards and the committees are very happy to say, you know what, you didn't perform there, you don't get paid at median. I have a lot of clients that, particularly in 09, said, you know, the bonus is zero. The formula may be higher than that, but we're applying discretion, the bonus is zero. So I would go back to a couple of things. One, I don't get a vote. So I provide the information that I'm requested to provide, but I don't get a vote. And we've actually changed the model of how these things work over the past number of years. I've always been at an independent firm in the last number of years. But you're right, we do have historically the idea that management and the committee were very close, and the consultant was also very close to management. That was the historical model. I don't have a single client now that has a non-independent consultant that is doing piles of work for management that's also doing piles of work for the committee. So that's history. I hear about the Lake Wobegon effect, which is what you're describing, this ratchet up, very regularly. People, that's a common complaint about the compensation services industry. But I would say that I don't use peer groups in that way. At the end of the day, compensation is a business decision. And if you need to hold that person and you don't have 5 other successors, one of whom is better, well, then you have to make a decision whether you're going to keep that person or you're going to get rid of them or let them go. I have some home building clients, and what's shocking is that maybe 4 years ago, the average bonus was maybe $10 million in cash, because they were returning total returns to shareholders every year, 50% a year, year over year, year over year. They thought this was great. It's going to continue forever. Lo and behold, they found there was a bubble and doesn't work, and the first boards that said, you know, this can't continue. I can't keep paying this person who's managing a little company like the CEO of GE. That took a lot of guts, and that took a strong decision on the part of the committee. So I provide the data they want to look at. I'll give them advice. But actually, unlike an auditor, the only recourse that I have if I think a committee has gone awry is to walk away and rescind that client. We're one of the firms that walked away from Countrywide. We rescinded that account.
And one last question. Anybody over here on the right, young folks? Please.
Sure. So you referenced the election earlier, and you said that a lot of people, in their anger at TARP and other bailouts, hired their legislators. So what are some legislative effects that you can expect in the next months? Or not? Is it just no more TARPs?
I'll let the other folks, since I'm too close to politics. I would interpret that, frankly, you will get less action on these issues. There won't be bailouts as defined like TARP, although I don't, as I answered the gentleman's question about Fannie Mae and Freddie, I don't think there will be a resolution of the GSEs because it's practically not responsible to solve that problem by taking away their backstop by the federal government in the current environment. But on these kinds of issues, whether you'll have a proactive push of the SEC or the CFTC or any of the regulatory bodies into this area, I think actually is diminished by the returns as opposed to increased by. I mean, I think there's a sigh of relief on a lot of folks' part that our next guest, who will be speaking here, Gary Gensler, the head of the CFTC, will be sitting in front of a financial institutions House committee justifying whatever aggressive stance he might want to take in those areas. And I think that very absolutely would be true with regard to compensation. But that's, you know, and I admit that I have some political bias in my view, but I think that you will have a backing away who is anti-tax, anti-government, anti-regulation that you, I think, is one of the messages that you heard. Anti-bailout, obviously, but I don't think you'll see as much proactivity as you would have seen otherwise. And so I think Bill's probably more right than wrong in that if you believe we haven't done much to solve the compensation issue, let's just leave it at that. And I don't think there's anything that came out of the elections that is actually going to accelerate that process.
But if compensation was a cause of the bailouts, and we want no more bailouts, then shouldn't we address compensation? Or is there,
I think, I mean, I don't want to preempt, I should be quiet, but the solution to this problem, in one sense, is leadership on boards making their own decisions on how they operate, and I think it would be wise. I think investors might appreciate steps like Bill is suggesting, and maybe will improve a stock price, which is a good thing, but it's not going to be mandated because a regulator or the SEC or your friendly representative from government is sitting in your boardroom suggesting that you do the kind of things that were talked about with the AIG board.
Well, there was a huge opportunity to change the compensation system that is now, you know, just as after the crash of '87, there was a huge sort of collective feel that we can't let this happen again. After 2008, there was a huge collective fear, right? I mean, what have we just done to ourselves? You know, if we just killed capitalism, we killed the golden goose. Let's you know, step back and try to fix the system. Well, you know, a huge opportunity was offered and was not taken advantage of. And these elections are, you've got this 2,300-page Dodd-Frank law now that doesn't address, except for this, you know, say on pay aspect, which to me is laughable, so that you know, get people, you know, to vote, shareholders vote on whether or not they like a company's compensation system, and then the board of directors are free to disregard it. So that's exactly not, that has nothing to do with change or changing the compensation system. After I wrote that piece in October, the current chairman and CEO of Goldman Sachs called me up. We had a lovely hour-long discussion about my article and what I was proposing, and I was arguing to him that, as Governor Corzine was just sort of alluding to, there is a real opportunity. I mean, Goldman Sachs is a leader in this industry, despite, you know, their bad PR they've had for the last year. Is a leader in this industry and is in a position to take a leadership role by changing their compensation system. Wall Street is basically a cartel. What do cartels do? I'm not an economist, but they do everything they can to control the value of the services they provide and the price that the customers have to pay. So whether it's underwriting stocks or bonds or providing trading or whatever it is, I mean, again, this is potentially somewhat controversial, but they're a cartel. And the only problem is that they don't use their cartel power when it comes to compensation. Then they rely and say, oh, we're just market-based. We have to, pay what, or else they're going to leave en masse and go over to Deutsche Bank. We're going to lose, this group of traders. Well, to the professor's point, I say, let them go. Let them go. Call their bluff. I mean, there's no reason in the world that these people have to be paid as much as they're paid. And I think there's an opportunity that is unfortunately missed. And we're just, frankly, now just waiting till the next crisis comes along because, as I like to say, is, why do scorpions sting? Scorpions sting because that's what they're on Earth to do. Why do Wall Street bankers and traders are on Earth at the moment to get paid as much as they possibly can, taking risks with other people's money, and nothing has changed.
On this cheery note, tonight we will have Andrew Ross Sorkin and Gary Gensler here to talk about the organization of the markets post the crisis. It ought to be a great continuation. Thank you, panel.